Hello and welcome to Rebuild. Here we explore the pillars that hold up the foundations of Christianity and Western culture, and we examine where and how these pillars are crumbling, and then we think about what we can do to rebuild those pillars. Today we're going to talk about the mold that shapes and forms all of the pillars of Western civilization. That mold is culture, and more specifically, Christian culture. No pillar of Western civilization is built in a vacuum or without any sort of guidance or dictate as far as its shape and its nature. In short, these pillars that we analyze on this podcast were built in the context of Christian thought and morality. In other words, in Christian culture. Our thesis for today is that Christians must engage in the process of producing Christian culture, that it's required of us. And that leads to our provocative question for the episode. Is the American church sinfully failing to carry out the cultural mandate that God has given to Christians? Is the American church failing in this mandate?
Yeah, so we'll get into answering that question a bit towards the end of the episode. So to start thinking about the topic of Christian culture, we both listened to a lecture given to the Ezra Institute in Toronto, Canada, by a speaker called Andrew Sandlin. The talk was called Why Christian Culture, the Roots and Reign. We'll link to that video in the description below. And it's the first lecture of a two-part series. And Sandlin argues that from the beginning of the church, Christians understood that because God had freed them from sin and given them new life, the freedom of Christians was actually a freedom to obey God and live their lives in a way that honored him. So he argues, Sandlin that is, argues that the broader application is not just this personal piety, our direct relationship with God. He explains it in terms of a vertical relationship, but it is also a horizontal relationship that has a broader implication into how we understand the essential nature of family, how we need to take up the mantle to take proper dominion over the earth. Obviously, the very first command was to take dominion over the earth and subdue it. And then he also argues that this cultural mandate expands into the impulse to create distinctively Christian culture, whose reach would spread into all areas of society and around them. Sandlin argues that this is the part of the process that the gospel spreads into culture. So if we're doing this properly, the gospel is going to be spreading into culture, and that we should expect to see it when people are transformed by the gospel. The kind of culture they are and their nation produces will be more honoring to God when this Christian cultural mandate is effectuated properly. So we're going to talk about a few specific points from that video, and then we'll have some thoughts of our own, and then we'll answer the question of what happens, what do we do with the truth that Sandlin is talking about? How does it affect Christians and the church in America right now?
Okay, great. Yeah, so that's kind of a summary of his argument, but we wanted to look at two specific quotes from his video. And I found these quotes really thought-provoking. One of the things that was the most helpful to me was he gave a really good definition of culture. So if you watch the video, it's at about the 11-minute mark, more or less. And this is what he says. This is how he defines culture. He says culture, strictly defined, denotes those products of human interactivity with nature that reflect the self-conscious goal of human benefit. Education, science, entertainment, technology, architecture, the arts, even such simple human products as meals, toys, and personal grooming products, and we could go on and on. The category of culture introduces a sharp divide from nature or creation. He's still going on. I'm still quoting here. We know that God created nature. It is his handiwork. God does not create culture, not directly anyway. Creation is what God makes. culture is what we make. And then here he quotes John Frame. He says, John Frame says, and he's right, culture is quite different from creation. Its distinctive trait is the human use of that creation for man's benefit. Culture is what we get when man intentionally employs creation for beneficial purposes. And he has a really great example. He says a tomato is God's creation. Pizza or spaghetti sauce is man's creation of culture. What strikes me here is that creating culture, this was really helpful to me. Creating culture is an inevitable part of life for every human in existence. All of us interact with the natural world to intentionally benefit humanity, okay, in small ways or large ways. The way a mom cooks for her family forms part of that family culture. The way a chef seeks to provide the best dining experience for his guests creates culture. And so it's super helpful, I think, for us to understand that to be a human is to be involved in creating culture. And given that that's the case, it's a little bit of a weight of responsibility that we need to bear. We need to think about that God has an expectation for what kind of culture we should produce. God is very interested in what kind of culture we produce.
Yeah, and he talks about that. He spins off, this is our last quote from his video specifically, but he talks about that a little bit later in the video, a few minutes later. And this is what he says in regards to the kind of culture that we should create and its counterpart. So he says, God's design is that godly people produce culture. But because of sin, sinful people now produce culture. Sinful people in the post-fall world fulfill the cultural mandate no less than we believers do. This, in fact, constitutes the great conflict in our world. Two kinds of people with two very different spiritual natures and fundamentally conflicting convictions, both shaping the world, intentionally or not. So, just an analysis of what he's talking about there. We have Christians and non-Christians, both with a mandate, humans with a mandate to create. The fall made it so that it's not just godly people creating culture, but both. And that creates conflict in the world. And it's interesting that he points out that we're all creating culture, whether we know it or not. So let's go on here. And it says Christian culture, not him, but this is just some thoughts that we had written down. Christian culture is more than art. So when I think of culture in years past, it's really easy to get caught up in just like what we traditionally define as the arts, so the music, art, movies, all those kind of things that are tangible, artistic goods. We kind of have come to shallow the definition of culture to just that, but it's actually not. It includes all parts of creation that we interact with. So creation is the natural order, and the way we interact with that creation. In some cases, we use it physically. We take rock and we make stones to build houses with. That is all culture. In other cases, it's not necessarily physical. It's theories of economics and government, a true understanding of love is, the value of the individual. All of that is cultural thought that has underlying implications for how we live and how we live as a society. Christian culture, therefore, is when we work with and within the world that God made with the self-conscious goal of human benefit. So if we work with the world and within it, we have a conscious goal that is going to benefit us, but also bring God glory. Christian culture must align with God's commands and values, and therefore it is produced mainly by godly people. However, it's kind of a circular process, so that godly people produce Christian culture, and then that culture then reinstills godly values, which then in turn create godly people. That goes on and on and on in a circle like that. So Christian culture, it produces people, men and women who act according to God's definition of reality, somewhat instinctively, and that's why we don't always pay attention to the fact that we are interacting with culture, because we build a culture that kind of becomes ingrained in us, and we don't really realize that our interactions are cultural in nature. So when good Christian culture is present, men are challenged to provide, to lead, to protect. Women are encouraged to nurture, to foster life and to grow and growth. And children are expected to respect their parents and other authorities. When Christians interact with the natural order in ways that honors God, these values and others will be built into society, even if that society is as small as a single family. In fact, that's the area of life that we have the most impact is in the single family setting. So based on Sandlin's comments, we can identify marks of healthy Christian culture and the marks of the culture that does not honor God. So we know that when culture breaks down, it is no longer reinforcing God's truth in His created order. It reinforces practices, products, and ideas that deny and defy the realities that Christ is King and that He has established a specific order to creation that we are to follow. When this happens, it is possible for Christians to still do and teach things that honor God, but it's much harder for the fruit to be born from that, for that to bear fruit throughout generation to generation. And not only will it be more difficult, but the non-Christian culture around will think it is strange and foolish to submit to God's order, and may also actively resist these godly cultural impulses.
Yeah, so just for myself, as we were listening to this video and thinking about what you said there, Bradley, the idea of culture can be kind of off in the distance, right? Kind of vague and nebulous, and I'm not really a cultural person. I don't really think of in terms of culture, or I think it's really helpful what you're saying there, that we live within culture, and if we're not careful to create the kind of culture that will produce the kind of people that we want our children and our grandchildren to become, there's a possibility that our children and grandchildren actually won't become those people. None of us live in a vacuum. We all live in a context. And so I think what you say is helpful there. As we were looking at that idea of culture perpetuating kind of an instinctive understanding of how God has made the world, right? What is right, what is wrong? I got to thinking about how a lot of times we complain now about how our culture is so much less godly, or should I say in line with what God has established in creation. We could talk about how now we question whether or not God created man, male, and female, that sort of thing. So a lot of times we complain about, well, we're much less godly in our culture now than we were before. And that got me thinking, this is not something that Sandlin talked about, but it got me thinking about how culture changes, right? And specifically how it devolves, how it gets worse, and how it breaks the boundary of what is accepted or viewed as good at one time and then no longer is. In other words, how do bad ideas and how have bad ideas infiltrated our culture to weaken what used to be God-centered beliefs that were commonly held in practice? Okay, so for instance, I'm not saying that this example is necessarily a God-centered belief, but in modern times, women wear bathing suits when they swim, and no one cares. And in fact, predominantly, women wear a two-piece bathing suit, right, a bikini. And yet, when we look back in time, this was not the case. In 1776, women like Martha Washington, she was quite famous for this. They used to swim in a full gown, right? And in fact, they were so serious about preserving their modesty that they would sew little lead weights onto the bottom hem of the gown to keep the skirt from billowing up in the water. Right? The idea of modesty at that time required this sort of outfit. There was a time also when the men, they would wear a shirt. They wouldn't bathe without a shirt on. They would wear a longer pant type swimming suit. And that's because, again, the idea of modesty. Now they don't do that. And what is acceptable today was not acceptable at different times. And so my question, what I'm really wondering is, what do we do if we're trying to preserve Christian culture and produce Christian culture? What do we do about people who want to push the edges of what is acceptable, even in a moral sense, right? Let's say that it starts, and this is more and more the case, that a woman wants to keep her last name when she marries, or maybe even wants her husband to take her last name. Now, this might seem very inappropriate to some of us now, but I can imagine a situation where this happens very commonly in the future and nobody cares. If we don't think that should happen, is it reasonable now to say, well, that's ridiculous, no one can ever do that? What about the sexualization of advertising? You know, it used to be on television that actors and actresses would sleep in separate beds when being filmed. And this is classically shown with Lucille Ball and her husband. They were married in real life, and they played a married couple in I Love Lucy. And yet still, when they filmed the two of them, they would sleep in separate beds. And yet now we see, you know, obviously rampant and grotesque sex scenes that show all sorts of stuff, and it's a big change. How did that happen? Someone pushed the boundary somewhere. What should have the response been? You know, what terrifies me about this trend is we now see things like pedophilia becoming more normalized, and people say, well, we're just taking this little step and this little step and this little step. Where does it lead, and what should our response be? You see, I think Christian culture breaks down when people are given permission to question what God has said. I don't mean to ask an honest question, but to, in a sense, not believe what God has said. This is what happened with Adam and Eve, and it's what happens now. And like Eve, she was apparently not prepared. Adam didn't step in and defend her. She wasn't equipped to counter the lie properly. So it's kind of like a watercolor painting. Watercolors, the paintings, they don't have a precise edge between one shape and the other, and one color and the other, because the water causes the colors to kind of bleed and blend together. In fact, that's actually part of the artistry of watercolor painting is managing that bleeding and blending effect. Christian culture suffers when we don't know the boundaries and when we don't draw them very clearly. And when we become experts at managing this bleed and this ebb and flow rather than experts at knowing what the boundary actually is. But Christian culture also breaks down when it fails to keep building. So not only does it break down when we can question the boundaries and no one can say what the boundary is, but it fails and it breaks down when we fail to keep building, right? And this is really a challenge to me. There's no state of rest for culture, right? There's no kind of resting heart rate of culture. Because there's no state of rest for humanity's tendency to produce and to create. And so I would argue that as the population generally increases, as we're increasingly producing and seeking to do new things and try new things, the idea of the puddle of culture is always getting larger. And so if the puddle is culture, and if it's always getting larger and larger as people create and produce and come up with new ideas and things like that, as the puddle gets larger, it can change even if the amount of quote unquote Christian culture remains the same. Right? The Christian part will become more and more diluted because more and more water or mud or whatever foreign liquid is being added to the puddle. So the Christian part can become diluted if we are not working constantly to not only maintain the amount of Christian culture that we're producing, but also to fill up the puddle more and more with Christian culture. So two ways that we fail. We don't know the boundary and we don't draw the boundary clearly, and we fail to keep up. We stop producing culture so that more culture is being produced that's not of a Christian influence. And this leads to an important question about why so many Christians think that it's not important to work towards this end, to create a culture that is distinctly Christian. Because I think, Bradley, as you and I have talked, we were in this position, not many months ago, where we really, really diminished the idea of producing and creating Christian culture. And we see this very common among evangelicals in America now. And the question is, why do we view this as not important? And one reason, I actually think you kind of fleshed this out a little bit, Bradley. One reason that we doubt that anything good can come is that we doubt that anything good can come from a fallen world or fallen humanity. And going back to Sandlin's video, about the 7-minute mark, he explains that creation was and is good. However, because of the fall, creation bears the mark of sin's pollution, and therefore it's subject to the redemption work of Christ. In other words, the redemption of Christ does not just extend to us as Christians, it extends to creation, which was subjected to futility, right? Everything under the domain of sin, Sandlin argues, is going to be redeemed through Christ's work on the cross. Therefore, the redemption of creation is a part of the gospel. While it's true that this redemption is primarily going to be accomplished when Christ returns and the earth is purified with fire, this is references from Romans 8 and 2 Peter 3, this does not mean that we ought to ignore the natural world in the here and now. This would be to fall into the dualistic heresy of Gnosticism all over again. Right? Gnosticism was maybe the first heresy, and it held that the physical world is bad, and the spiritual world is really the good, and we should aspire to the spiritual world. Okay? And this created this idea that salvation is freedom from physicality, from matter and material, to pursue purely spiritual objectives, goals, and practices. But the thing is, this is a heresy. It was branded as a heresy by the early church. However, we actually often live as though Gnosticism were actually true. We're suspicious of the material world, and specifically, we are suspicious of interacting with the material world. But what Sandlin points out is that Christian culture is the intentional interaction between people and nature, and this process is inevitable. And because it's inevitable, culture will either be produced that still reflects fallenness and depravity and rebellion to God, or culture will be produced when Christians submit themselves and the nature that they're using to God in a redemptive process. The analogy of a family, I think, is helpful here. We were casting about for good analogies here, and while the family is we come back to this a lot. I think it's helpful. If a husband and a wife get saved, they might start to train their children to fear and obey God, right? And they will start going to church. And because they're Christians now, they'll love their neighbors and they'll start praying for their leaders. And in a sense, we would say that the family has been redeemed because their actions and priorities and behaviors are pointed towards glorifying God. But they, through their obedience to God, they weave. It's not that the family unit is saved in that sense, but rather they weave their godly priorities and ideas and practices into their family, right? Into their parenting. And in the same way, when Christians obey God in their business practices, in their education, in the way that they produce and enjoy food, and they weave the redemption of Christ that's in their hearts through the culture that they create and participate in. And by the same token, when they avoid and when they call out and reject such practices that are opposed to Christ, like in a business world, getting ahead by cheating or lying or being dishonest, or a student using the school system to promote, or a teacher using it to promote ungodly worldviews, enjoying food to the point of gluttony or drunkenness, that the Christians must reject those non-Christian cultural interactions and productions. Humanity was asked to exercise dominion over the earth. And the part of that equation that has changed is not the earth, it's humanity. Right? And so Christians who have been made free from sin and been made free to obey God ought to embrace the ability to create culture that is distinctly Christian, that is distinctly God-honoring. Christians continue to exercise dominion and subdue the earth. Only now, as we create culture that pleases and honors God, we can then turn around and present it back to God, that creation of culture, with thanksgiving and as an act of worship. And so believing that this is both one of the primary ways to obey God, to benefit the people around us, and to show what it looks like when people submit themselves to God's will, we Christians should desire to spread this kind of culture, these kinds of practices, these kinds of beliefs. I think this is in part of what I think this is part of what it means that we are to be a light and a city on the hill. Commenting on this idea, Joseph Boot, in his book, which I highly recommend, it's called simply The Mission of God, he says this, quote, "We have been called to spiritual horticulture. We tend God's garden when we make known his gospel, uphold his law, serve his righteousness, and bear his image, not just in evangelism and our personal lives, but in all socio, political, and cultural engagement," end quote. And for many groups of believers, this has included everything from nation building to science to training children to follow God, every part of life.
Yeah, that's really good. There's a lot there. I'm going to comment on a couple things and then kind of move on to another reason that we have a hard time engaging with Christian culture. You were talking about the heresy of Gnosticism and our skepticism of the world and the material world, how we place emphasis on the spiritual good, as the spirit as good and physical as bad. And a lot of that stems from this heart of idolatry that every Christian is fully aware of that we have. We get very concerned about idols, and rightfully so. It's in the Ten Commandments. In fact, it references twice, I believe, the idea that we shouldn't have envy in our hearts or physically make idols. But this skepticism or hesitancy shouldn't mean that we abstain from it. We should just guard against it. So I think that's one, in my life thing that it's always just completely avoid, completely cut out. But we cut out, goodnesses of life in doing so. It's kind of like throwing the baby out with the bathwater to a degree. And then you mentioned that the family is to bear a resemblance of this, right? But we create these things in our family, like we weave these redemptive qualities and these Christian values into our family, but with a very stern awareness that it's what we're doing. And that awareness in and of itself is part of Christian culture. It's the idea that we are doing this with purpose. We're doing this for a reason, not just for the spiritual redemption of it, which is ultimately the goal and supremely valuable, but we're doing it so that that culture carries on and is established and carries on. So we're making Christian culture when we have that stern, very real awareness of what it is that we're doing within the world. And then the last point is just in that idea of using that culture and taking it to the world. And traditionally, most Christians think, we have this light inside of us, and then we just need to go tell people about Jesus And yes, we do need to tell people about Jesus, but that's not the only level of engagement that we can have a positive impact in. We can take the good things that we have built, that we've created, that we've established in our lives, and simply show them to the world. And they should be appealing and pleasing to people who see that. So it's not just this, let's take the good news. Yes, we need to evangelize and tell them about Jesus, but also we can tell them the way our marriage works. Hey, my wife and I had a great date, a couple days ago. And some people might go, dates, good date, enjoyable time with your wife. What's that? Whatever it plays out. Or, I really enjoy going home and spending time with my kids. Yeah, it's a lot of work. And there are times where, I kind of have to pick myself up and motivate myself to do it. But I enjoy it. And I enjoy the time I spend with my kids. Those kind of things are Christian culture, gospel witnesses that aren't directly the Jesus conversation. We need to have those conversations, but those conversations need to happen in appropriate contexts and with an undergirding of truth behind it that they can see in our lives. So those are my comments in regards to what you just said there. Another reason that I think that we struggle with this idea of Christian culture is we tend to think, and it kind of goes back to the Gnosticism idea, we tend to think that the earth is sort of doomed already. Like, we know there's going to be a new heavens and a new earth when Christ comes back. We know that Satan has immense power on earth. And we just simply observe around us that everything seems to go wrong. Man's heart is bent towards evil, and the earth kind of follows suit with that. And so we just kind of throw our hands up and say, come back quickly, Jesus, or take me home quickly, Jesus, or, that seems to be the only hope that we have, which gets me to thinking about, does Satan actually have as much power as we give him in the earth? Is the earth ultimately doomed, or do we actually have a say in the dominion of the earth and the direction of, and I don't say the earth like Mother Nature, I mean like just the way the world works, the order of the world? Do we actually have a say in that, or is it just purely God's given Satan control, and we can hope for Jesus' return? That's kind of a wrong perspective in my view. Yes, I'm not diminishing the power of Satan. He has immense power on the earth, but that power is given to him. Satan's power was the biggest part of the curse after the fall. But Jesus uses language in John 14 about the ruler of the world coming and how it will separate us from God. So that's acknowledging that Satan has a certain amount of power that's going to separate us from God, and that the whole world lies in the power of the evil one. But that power was given to Satan as a result of the fall. And God ultimately has the power to take that away, which means he has the ultimate authority. And just as he gives power to Satan, he can just as easily pull that away. In fact, that's part of the redemptive plan that we've been talking about. This whole idea that Christian culture is going to fight that power of Satan and the dominion of Satan back. Ultimately, it's going to be perfectly renewed when Christ comes back. But our culture, the things we do and the culture we create, can push that back. See, Jesus also says in John 12 that the world is now in judgment and that the ruler of the world will be cast out. So Jesus is judging the world. He's actively judging. He's going to give an ultimate judgment and cast him out in the end. But we can fight against that as we go through our lives. And then in Revelation 12, it says that the devil has come for us with great wrath, but because he knows, he comes with us with this wrath because he knows that his time is short. That's out of Revelation 12. So yeah, Satan has this power, but he doesn't have full dominion. He doesn't have full control. We can fight against it. Colossians 2 says God, through Jesus' death and resurrection, made us alive together with him, disarming Satan and putting him to shame. So as believers, Satan doesn't actually have control or power over us, and the things that we do carry great weight and great power. So that's one of the motivations that I've been finding recently in how to engage with Christian culture. It's not doom and gloom. There's hope. We can do things. Michael talked about Joseph Booth, and in Revelation, he also talks about the fact that the titles of kingdoms of priests were given to first Christ. And this is from Joseph Booth. He is the king and the perfect high priest, but we are made to be rulers and priests with him. And Booth argues that the original dominion of the earth has been given to Christ, but that we share in executing that dominion now. As a kingly priesthood, we are called to work and serve under the scepter of our great high priest, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, applying the crown rights of the king in each area of life. So we have control through authority that Christ has given us on earth. A third reason I guess we could get into as to why we don't engage with culture properly is because we don't have a broad perspective of what culture is. And the more Michael and I dig into this, the more we realize that we don't have a very good understanding. Like, it's a huge topic, a huge discussion to be had. So we're just scratching surface level here and in way over our heads. But I traditionally have always thought of, we talked about it earlier, just the fact that culture is just the arts, the movies, the TV shows, the books we read, the music we listen to, and I don't have any of those giftings, those abilities very well. So, I can't really affect culture, right? Like it's just, I'm just going to do my thing and that's going to be it. But that's a shallow view of what culture actually is that I think a lot of us as Christians suffer from. Like Sandlin said in his definition of culture that we quoted earlier, education, science, entertainment technologies, architecture, yes, the arts, but even such things as human products as meals, toys, personal grooming products, all of that is part of culture. We could add things like transportation to his list, infrastructure, sports, hobbies, all of that is culture. If the hands of man have made it, used it, interacted with it, it's part of culture. The interaction with God's creation is cultural at heart. So anything we do in this earth that interacts with the nature that God has created, that is culture, whether by mind, by hand, by thought. Those are all cultural things. Healthy, godly culture emboldens men and women. We talked about this briefly earlier too. Emboldens men to fulfill their roles. Men resolve to subdue and create, to lead and protect. Women are encouraged and to fulfill their roles as helpers. They're encouraged in that to nurture life, and to literally make life and grow is esteemed and encouraged. Those are all good things. Neither of them are more important, but both are aligned in a pursuit of goodness. That way the way we parent automatically creates culture, and this is a convicting thought because the Bible, the family unit even precedes the church. It's the fundamental unit that God uses to expand his kingdom. So the things we do in our family, the culture we create in our immediate families has the biggest impact on the way culture is shaped beyond our family. So this gets to our question. Is the church doing this? Is the church doing this well? And I think Michael and I, at large, the church in general in the country, don't think that the church is engaging this very well. We expect when missionaries go out that they change the hearts of men, so that those men and women change the hearts of their neighbors, and you have this cultural revival in communities. And missionaries specifically, they go to areas that are very unchurched. I mean, that's what missionaries target, is areas that are very non-Christian, limited number of churches, if any, in the area. And they go there to change culture for the gospel, to change people's hearts towards Christ. But we don't expect that necessarily from the church in America. What the church in America expects is be a good Christian, tell people about Jesus, and don't stir the pot too much. That's largely the way most of us in America live, is be good Christians and don't stir the pot. So I don't think, and Michael doesn't think either, that the church is doing this very well. And we could be in a bit of sin as a result of it.
Yeah, I mean, it's very true what you say about how we think it would be natural for a missionary to go to, a tribe somewhere where they're, running around eating each other and not wearing any clothes, which I'm not using hyperbole here. This actually was the situation in many places where missionaries have gone. And we would expect, obviously, the missionaries are going to preach the gospel, right? We're not saying they go there just to change the dress code. But because they preach the gospel and because some of them believe in the gospel, the expectation becomes, okay, now you need to live in the way that God expects. You need to stop eating each other, right? You do need to put some clothes on. I'm not saying it has to be a 3-piece suit from London, but the idea of covering ourselves and whatnot, that should be now an expectation, and that changes culture, right? That does. The culture that was there before is changed. And man, Bradley, I just can't agree enough with this idea that it's a little bit silly for us to expect that missionaries will go out and do this sort of thing, but yet we're unwilling to see that as part of our mission here back home. I mean, obviously
because we're more civilized, right?
Right.
we've arrived at our pinnacle, right? So we've arrived, so we don't have anything to change or affect or adjust. Like, we just live within the culture that exists here. But our culture, we're wearing clothes and we're not eating people, but we're no more civilized in our hearts than tribal communities that are doing those things. Yeah.
I wanted to just kind of pull two things out there before we kind of start moving towards wrapping up here. One thing that I wanted to pull out from what you said was, in Joe Boot's quote there, the first step in creating an expansive or systemic Christian culture is, of course, spreading the gospel, sharing the gospel, preaching the need to repent from sin and turn to Christ, right? Obviously, this will be very limited if all we're doing is putting programs into effect. But I think it's a mistake also to think that if 100% of the people in a society are not Christians, then systems or cultural practices that are in line with God's commands will have no fruit or no effect. And I think one error is to say we're going to just create a system, no gospel involved. But the other one is to say only gospel and not Christians living in the way that God has asked them to do. And when we as Christians live according to our transformed by the gospel hearts, that will have a product and that will influence society. The second thing that you kind of alluded to, but I just want to make sure that we're clear about, is, like you said, you didn't consider yourself to be like a cultural person because you're maybe not making movies or producing music or, creating statues of the David, that sort of thing like Michelangelo. And yet we all have ways that we interact with nature and natural processes. But one of the big things that we tend to overlook here is the fact that people are part of the natural world that God has created. And so how we interact with one another, with the people around us, is actually part of creating culture. And so this gets right into things like government and economics and social structures and all of those things. So all of those things, whether it's the relationship between a mother and child, a husband and wife, or whether it's bigger, like how we interact with each other in a governmental and societal level, that is part of culture because people are created by God. And when we interact with God's creation, we are creating culture.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is all good and well in the hypothetical abstract. You and I want to have actionable items. We want to have things that we can challenge people to do. It's easy to get caught up in talk, and we get overloaded with information. But we want practical ways that we can put some of this stuff into action. We can, it's an awareness plus action. So we want. So we want the process of making culture, of making product, of making and producing ideas, pieces of art, value systems, beliefs, goods and products. This is all inevitable. We're all doing this, no matter whether we know it or not. Culture is being created. Humans naturally do this as part of the mandate that God has given us, and we've seen that. God does, in fact, want the culture that Christians make to be distinctly Christian. He wants all culture to be distinctly Christian, but in a fallen world, it's never going to get quite there. But we've seen that when Christians actually create good culture, create good underlying structures, they not only show the world how good God is to the order of life and the way to order life the way that He has ordered it in the Scripture, but ultimately it presents a beautiful offering to God when we do that. So how do we do this? What are the practical steps we take? And Michael has a couple here, and then I'll kind of close it up with a couple of my own.
Okay. We've already mentioned it, but it's so critical and so fundamental that I'm mentioning it again as my first actionable item, and that is just simply to consider the role the family has in creating culture. So a couple things with this. First of all, we need to train families to see that cultural creation is part of a family mission, right? Children need to know we're not just here to live until we die. We're also not just here to have quiet times every day, right? We as a family are here to produce something that's pleasing to God with how we live, with how we work, with what we do, with what we produce. Okay? So do our children know that we ought to produce habits and products and attitudes that honor God by benefiting the society around us? Like, do we talk about this with our children? How does this change the conversation of how much time on the video game console we can be spending, right? Dad, can I spend 30 minutes? No, 20 minutes. Oh, come on, 30 minutes. Like, I'm not saying right in that moment, but are we talking with our kids about, hey, look, our time is God's, and He expects us to develop practices that produce something that help the world around us to show that we love Christ and that the gospel has changed us, right? So do we see our kids' soccer practice or participation in a sport as part of a culture that pleases God? This was a really challenging thought to me. Can you, as a parent, make a case for why your weekly activities do actually connect to an overall intention to interact with nature with the self-conscious goal of human benefit? I know we get busy, right? We come home, we throw dinner together, you help kids with homework, you get them to bed, and days go by, and weeks go by, and months go by. And yet, maybe it's time to build into your schedule some time to really sit down and think through, are my own personal or are my family weekly activities producing something that is distinctly Christian, or am I just surviving and getting by, right? And this is how I wrapped it up, or do most of what your family does simply serve to pass the time, or even worse, to expressly only benefit yourself, right? And just sit around and do something that is only for the benefit of yourself, and not really consider how you're benefiting other people. So that's my first one, really reconsidering the family's role in culture and in creating culture and producing culture. My second one is this idea of excellence. Okay, this idea of excellence. We need to train ourselves. We need to train our families. We need to train people who are going to be employees. We need to train people who are going to be students to pursue excellence in everything that we do, right? Whether we eat or we drink, we are to do all to the glory of God. And this means that Christians should be known for excellence in what we do, not because we are making an idol out of an activity, right? There's a difference between someone who has made an idol out of money, and so he wants to become the best businessman that he can to gain the most money and prestige and power that he can. That is making that an idol. But when we see the activities that we're doing as something that we offer back to God, the products of our time, the products of our attitudes, the products of our desires, we offer those back to God. And in that sense, what are we presenting to Him, right? Are we presenting to Him excellence and a desire to do our best for Him? And it's interesting that one of the fallouts is when this sort of Christian culture is visible, oftentimes the businesses run by Christians or the employees that come out of Christian families are seen as the most excellent, the most skilled, the most focused on the good end product or the hardest working people. And this used to be the case in America, right? But I think what we missed there was they weren't doing that just to have an excellent business. The excellence of the business or the excellence of the restaurant that they opened was a product of the fact that they were doing things excellently because they wanted to honor God and because they wanted to show that Christ is worthy of great effort and great, not effort to earn his favor, but exertion to honor him. So those are my two. We need to reconsider the family and how it can be part of the mission of producing culture, Christian culture, and then we need to re-indoctrinate in ourselves a culture of excellence, but excellence primarily and first and foremost for God's sake.
Yeah, the Amish come to mind in the excellence, right? Now, not everything the Amish do I agree with as far as the culture, because they're very secluded in what they've and almost to their credit, but also some of their detriment, they're unwilling to change with times and see that the natural things that God has created, like electricity and power tools and all those things, those can be used for good. But the work that they do is widely known as excellent work. They are excellent craftsmen. They are excellent farmers. They are excellent, naturalist food producers. So they come to mind when it comes to thinking about people that do excellence. And then just a note on your family point, I'm going to steal from Sandlin again here. He made a comment at some point in that talk that Christians far too often treat their walk with Christ as a personal hobby, and the Bible is kind of a textbook on how to do that hobby, and that doesn't really extend beyond their realm of it's a hobby for themselves. This personal piety is something we do for ourselves. So as a family, we just kind of keep it in ourselves, and we read our Bible, but there's no huge impact beyond. We don't know why we're doing it, other than the fact that it's just we're told to read and hide God's word in our heart. So that is not a critique of doing those things. It is obviously valuable, but when it is just done for the effect of doing it, it becomes very hobbyish in our action when it doesn't have broader implications and broader effects. So my two, one is just our attitudes. If when you and I were talking about this, and I was just kind of thinking through, how do we fix the brokenness of the world? And we're not going to, there's no silver bullet, but for me, there's two attitudes that if I could change, I think would go a long way to creating Christian culture and just a world more aligned to the world that God would have it, the world that God created. So those two attitudes are accountability. Each and every one of us need to take serious stock in every action and thing that we do, good or bad, but especially when it's bad. We need to be accountable for that, and that would have tremendous trickle-down effects throughout society. People respect people that take accountability, especially when it's accountability that's not necessarily their direct fault. Think of a business owner who ultimately is responsible for the business, and maybe an employee made the mistake, but the business owner takes the accountability of that. Think of a husband and a wife. The husband ultimately is accountable for what happens through the family, as he is called to be the leader of that family. So he is always first and foremost, or should always be first and foremost, to take accountability of what is happening in his family. And then obviously in the personal life, when we fail or when we do something that we shouldn't, we need to be accountable to it, and not just this idea of like holding other accountables in the cancel culture, sense, but just an earnest attitude that each and every one of us can have to accountability. And then the second attitude would be thankfulness. We've lost, even in my life, I've seen a dramatic disintegration of a thankful attitude, and not intentionally, not on purpose. But I do not think about the things that I have in a thankful manner as much as I should, and as much as I could, and as much as I would like to, and as much as I have in the past. But if we were just thankful for the things that we had, you know, I think about like a movie like The Christmas Carol, where Scrooge doesn't have any kind of a heart of thankfulness. And, you know, he gets visited by three ghosts, and they show him what the, you know, obviously we all know the story, the past, present, and future look like for him. And he is exposed to the lack of gratitude in his heart. And it's ultimately when he sees Bob Cratchit's family that he sees that a thankful heart is what produces true joy. And those ghosts are kind of the representation of our conscience, of the spiritual realm that works in our hearts and prods us to examine ourselves. And so he ultimately becomes a thankful man, and that change in his mentality changes his whole outlook on life. He becomes a generous man as a result. He still works hard. He still cares about his business. But what he does with that completely changes from the attitude of Thanksgiving. So accountability would be great for all of us to take note of, and then just a true, tremendous heart of thankfulness for everything that we have in our life. On an hourly, daily basis, we could be thankful for the things that we have.
I want to jump
again,
in there,
that has,
Bradley, before you go on to your next one.
Go ahead.
Because your point on accountability offers something that I think we need to say, because a couple times throughout this episode we said that when we as Christians live the way that we should, and we produce, even just in our own families or in our church or in our immediate sphere, the kind of culture that honors God, that this can be a testimony actually of the gospel. I think we miss the fact that when we live the way God wants us to and produce what God wants us to produce, this can be a testimony to the gospel. And so here's the illustration that I think of based on what you said with accountability, because you said, you know, a boss, if he screws up, or you know, a husband, you know, yells at his kids or whatever, he drops the ball, he can say, okay, that was my mistake. I can own that mistake. Now, why can that boss or the politician do that, who's a Christian? Well, the reason is because that man has been forgiven by Christ, right? There's no debt against him anymore. And so owning his mistakes and his responsibilities is something he can do because he's freed from the guilt of sin and from the consequences, the eternal consequences of that sin. And so he has the freedom to be able to say to his family, I screwed up, or to his company or to his country, you know, I'm going to take responsibility for that. Now, when we have that kind of culture, when we interact with each other in that way, that shows, man, why can that guy react that way? Right? Oh, it's because, and maybe he even has a chance to say, it's because I've been freed. I don't have to try and hide and justify myself all the time. I don't have to try and cover everything up for fear that I'll be exposed, right? So that's what I mean, where when we have the kind of culture that is distinctly Christian, that opens up a window to non-Christians for how life in God's family can look and should look.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's really good. Second point would just be an appreciation and understanding that the cultural mandate is something that we are to obey. So an active obedience in the cultural mandate. We need to see the cultural mandate as part of our purpose in obedience to God. Henry Netter says it's the execution of this divinely imposed mandate. In his cultural task, man is to take the raw materials of this universe and subdue them, make them serve his purpose, and bring them to nobler and higher levels. So think of, again, like when we take stone from the earth and make granite countertops. You know, we take them from a raw material to a finished, polished, higher, nobler level, thus bringing out the possibilities that are hidden in its nature. When thus developed, man is to lay his entire cultural product, the whole of creation, at the feet of him who is king of man and of nature, in whose image man and all things are created. This means that our worship of God is connected to producing culture that is distinctly Christian. If we diminish this idea, and if we do not think and intentionally try to produce culture that honors God, we neglect a huge part of what God expects from us. In short, we disobey him and fail to testify to who he is. And you think about the creation story in Genesis 1. Man is made in his image after God created. God is a creator, and a reflection of that. We are made in the image. We are to be creators. We are called to create, to cultivate. He gave Adam and Eve the mandate to subdue the garden, to name the animals. It's not that God didn't know how to name the animals, but he gave that as a gift to man to take on as a task to do. And we take things and their raw, rough nature, and we subdue them for their higher purpose. So when we don't do that, it's disobedience. And I think as we wrap up here, we can have maybe a short discussion on just, we think the church is failing in this area, maybe not necessarily implicitly, but we are so quick to rush to judgment when people take things seriously that aren't just their walk with Christ, right? I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but I know when, for me, like our heart is naturally bent towards idolatry. It's naturally bent towards obsessiveness. So there is danger there. But I think what the church's fault in this is that they generally think that if it's not purely Jesus, then it's not, it's become too important, right? So it's this, Jesus has to be the most important, and then everything else kind of trickles underneath that. As long as we kind of keep it in check, we can dabble, we can do a little bit here and a little bit there, but ultimately what we're talking about is a mind shift from yes, Jesus is ultimately important, but all that we do is in his name. So we can obsess about Christian culture and the nature of culture, even in the civics of government, and we can do that for the glory of God. Now that gets twisted real quick, and we always have to be checked. But we can do that in a way that is honorable to Christ, because it is part of his mandate. So I don't know if you had any thoughts about that.
I do. I just have two. One is simply a verse in Ephesians 2. It says, we've been saved by grace through faith, this not of ourselves, it's the gift of God, not by works, lest no one should boast. But then just right after that, in verse 10, it says that we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which he prepared beforehand for us. And so I think that we need to start considering that the good works for which he has prepared for us to do, are not simply, I'm going to have my quiet time. I'm going to work on having a pure thought life, those things. But it's also, our good works are, in a way, the light of the world and the city on the hill that burns brightly. And so when we do the things and produce the things, the kind of Christian culture that we're talking about, that is very much in line with the good works that we are called to do, not for our own glory, but that the gospel that is in our heart would shine brightly like a city on a hill. And that makes me think of my second kind of response to your question, Bradley, and that is in the movie Chariots of Fire. And it's such a profound moment in this movie, actually maybe one of the most profound things I've ever heard. Eric Little's sister is upset with him because he's bothering to take the time to run in the Olympics. And she's upset with him because he has been preparing for a large part of his life to go and be a missionary in China. And in her mind, this whole running in the Olympics thing is just a distraction and a waste of time, and she's worried that he's never going to get to China, right? But Eric Liddell, in trying to calm her down and explain himself to her, says this. He says, God made me for China. That's true. But he also made me fast. And when I run, I feel his pleasure. Such a profound idea that in his running, he is running in a way, and obviously if you know the story, he refuses to run on a Sunday, and so he gets switched to a race that he's never prepared for. And in that, he testifies to his willingness to follow God, but that he would consider his running as an act of his worship to God. We would say that's Christian culture, right? Yeah. He ran in a way that honored God, but he also didn't avoid running and go straight to China. Yeah. It's really, really a powerful example.
Yeah, he didn't subdue his nature. He didn't push it aside, because all that matters is Jesus. No, he used the running for Jesus and for an example. Yeah. So yeah, it's in a way it's taking I don't know why, but a dimmer switch on a light kind of comes to mind. It's taking that dimmer switch from the low setting that we have it on, and I felt this personally more than anything. This low dimmer switch of Jesus in my life with slow incremental changes, and turning that dimmer switch all the way up, and seeing how much more and how much broader that light casts, and how much more it touches, and how much more clearly I can see things and use things. And so I think that's kind of where we're at, and we're going to continue to explore this. I think in ways very specifically, we're going to try and explore this in ways that have this undergirding of Christian culture, but we're going to be talking about topics that aren't specifically gospel in orientation. They're not just the proclamation of Jesus, but they're how government works. They're how education works. They're how family structures work. We're going to explore as many of these pillars, these columns of civilization that we stand on. And they're all cast in this mold of culture. And that mold changes, right? It's going to change. We just need to make sure it changes and maintains its integrity. And right now, a lot of the pillars, I think, have lost, we've changed the mold to the point where they've lost the integrity, and they can't hold under the weight of civilization. They can't hold the weight that we need them to hold, because they've deviated from what they originally were and what they can be.
Yep. Okay, well, good stuff. Thanks for tuning in, and please check us out next time. Thanks, everybody.
All right. See ya.